Hey everybody, so we're going to finish out Module three's lectures, and we're going to start with, or continue, I guess, with Chapter 12. So let me go ahead and share my screen. This will be the last of it. And really, Chapter 12 is talking about urbanization and population. And so they started off with kind of a history of how cities came about, right? And so humans really started as this nomadic kind of being, right? They started in small kin-based groups, and then created groups that were based off of interpersonal relationships and or children making, and made slightly larger groups, etc. So small villages and towns came out of the ability to essentially create agriculture, the ability to not have to travel to find resources all year round, but the ability to actually feed yourself and the amount of people that you have. And so really, as agriculture processes continued to expand, as the tools for those continued to expand, and this is a gross oversimplification, so just FYI, if you want to learn more about this, there are several anthropology courses that will also help you kind of get into the nitty gritty a little bit more about this. But just broadly, with that agriculture process is really evolving and changing, and more tools like the plow, things of that nature, they began to be able to expand population wise in ways. And then when industrialization came, there was really this turn to urbanization, right? This turn towards people extensively not having to make their own food, having jobs, having cities that were really expanded in these big metropolitan areas. And so a city is described as a large number of people who live in one place and do not produce food for themselves. And then urbanization is the movement of masses of peoples into these cities, which then have a growing influence in society, right? So this ability to kind of hoard a great deal of people together and then form societal norms around that. A mega city is a population over 10 million or more, and there's quite a few of those globally at this point. And what we've really seen trend over the last 100 years is this vast migration to cities. And that's because of the resources they offer, because of the opportunities they offer, and just because as technology continues to increase, there's more diversity in job opportunities and educational opportunities for those jobs in bigger city options. And in some of those rural areas, you just don't have a significant portion of options when it comes to work and or any kind of social or economic mobility, or even job mobility for that matter. So with that being said, and these thinking about how much of our population lives in really urbanized areas, really when we talk about social problems, we're talking about urban problems. And the reason we say that is because if a grand percentage of our population is part of these big cities, then the cities themselves and the problems within them, even if they happen outside of the cities, become very much more frequent in big cities just because of the population ratio, right? So if you have 1% of your population who say is going hungry, and that's not an accurate stat, but for an example, if you only have 100 people in your little town, that's going to be one person. Even if you have say 10,000, that's still not a significant number of people. But if you're going into these cities that have tens of millions more, right, that's a significant portion of people going hungry. And that becomes a more crisis level conversation. And it becomes something that you can't sweep under the rug or ignore as easily. And so they did talk about urban crisis, or this idea that because of these mass populations and because so much of social problems live within urban settings, that there's this essentially crisis within this particular type of living. There's this crisis within um, urbanization that contributes to and or perpetuates social problems. And so we're going to talk a little bit about studying urbanization. For the record, down here in the bottom, where is the ratio for most urban cities versus least urban cities within the state. So places like Kentucky, all of these in the blue, these are the least urbanized places. Your ones in the green are going to be your most urbanized, which makes sense, right? Those are the coastal regions. Those are the New York Cities. Those are the Californias. Those are Seattle, places that we know have a significant portion of population and or large cities. They generally started as ports, cities. They generally hold a lot of commerce or business capitals or economic class points. These are the places that end up with these particular cities or hubs. And then you've got your ones in the middle that are kind of have your big cities, but also have a lot of rural area. All right. So as we start talking about studying urbanization, we're going to go into that same kind of threefold that we do regularly, where we talk about kind of this interactionary theory standpoint, the functionalist theory, this standpoint, and then conflict theory. So when we talk about symbolic interactionism, essentially we're talking about what do the people think about the social problems, about how the city contributes to them or responds to them or doesn't respond to them, or what resources they think they need, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? It's talking to the people specifically about whatever social problems are going on within their own community, right? And that can be at little subgroups within a city, that can be specifically a region. So think anytime you're talking to maybe a marginalized population within a city, right? That's going to be having a conversation directly geared towards how certain kinds of policies maybe are impacting them as people. But it's really getting down to that, again, individual level. The Chicago School of Sociology, it's a really well-known sociology program. It's one of the longest running in the country, if not the longest running in the country, actually. And they've been long time. Wow. They have been for a long time working with talking about specifically poverty, specifically at an individual level, how people are feeling any kind of pressure, economic pressure, and what that economic pressure is doing and how that is impacting the way they have to live. They do a lot of participant observation too. And that's something I wanted to kind of draw out and point out some attention to. Participant observation is a kind of study where essentially you are participating in whatever it is. So you're either working at a shelter and then you're studying the people that are there, or you're working at and or you're participating in living on the street while you're studying those who are also living in on the street in that area, or et cetera, et cetera. And those are some of the examples, right? Some are more extreme than others, right? Like if you're going to initiate yourself into a bikers gang to study bikers gangs, there's going to be some ethical review boards that are going to be like, whoa, hold on. And there's also going to be some debate on what kind of harm you're going to do depending on what it is and how you're engaging in that activity, in those activities, right? And that goes back all the way back to those kind of harmful studies that happened, like the Tuskegee Project, or when we did the jailhouse project, where essentially a psychologist wanted to know if they would follow some roles depending on if they were a jailer or someone pretending to be a prisoner, and it got really out of hand. But again, that's not always how that works. It can be something as simple as I'm going to volunteer at the soup kitchen or whatever, that I'm going to where I'm going to talk to people. And because of that, it allows me an extra bit of observation outside of just those conversations that I'm going to have with these individuals, and how they carry themselves, or what maybe social dynamics or groups are forming, or who people sit with, or where they sit in the room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it can be as simple as following eye contact or wanting to see how somebody carries themselves when they have to ask for or have to be part or take part of the resources that are being studied, et cetera. But there's a wide varying degree. In several of the conversations surrounding this, they were talking about specifically poverty and kind of how individuals in poverty um, really felt about their own situation or why they were in their own situation at a very individual level. And then again, they also talk about some urban decay, which is really just at the human level, like as cities infrastructure breaks down, or at the point in which certain parts of the city get taken for granted, or maybe not necessarily receiving the funds they need, or a subway station ends up getting closing, or et cetera, et cetera. How does this impact people at a human level, at a very day-to-day level? And again, those are examples I'm pulling up. Those are not necessarily the examples from the book. So then we get into our functionalist city plan. And this is really it, right? So we talk about functionalism as they're going to study whatever they're going to study as a organism, as a thing that operates how it needs to operate. And so it's going to have some bad things, it's going to have some good things, but those things are inherent to making the process keep going, right? And so they're going to study things like city planning. They're going to study how city planning, like say, a city wants to add or take away subway stations or make some more frequent. They're going to talk about how that might influence the populations, who that might leave out, um, how that might make something more functional, or what the latent and or intended consequences of those actions would be. So it's really talking about it from a very, not impersonal, but a very structural level, where it's less about the human emotion behind it and more about, does this function or not? Is it doing what it's intended to do? And why or why not, if that makes sense. And so then they also talked about the invasion succession cycle, which is really just when one group moves into an area already occupied by another group, and then they have very different characteristics, right? So this is going to create a situation where there could very well be tension, or it could very well change the dynamic of an area, or it could change what community-based things might be needed in the area. It could change the dynamic. You have an example of something like this is when a gentrification process, which we're going to talk about here in more depth in a little bit, but when that comes in, and so you have like younger, more economically prominent individuals coming into a neighborhood and kind of reviving it, but reviving it in a way that isn't economically feasible for the individuals that are still there. And so it leaves people disenfranchised from a community or from a space that they may already operate in. And then they talk about transitional zones, or essentially areas of the community where transition is happening, either economically, either depending on the groups that occupy the space, or any kind of transition from one thing to another, right? And that's just really, that happens regularly in cities, but they can have unintended consequences. And so being able to look at those and really figuring out if transitional zones, specifically in the model that they talk about, right, are going to have the ability to meet the needs of whoever's taking part in that transition, or whatever city is needing something to morph into something else, right? Or an area to morph into something else. And then we have conflict theory, which really, again, is talking about power and privilege, and how the wealthy and who can have power or who have economic gains are then going to be able to make policy decisions, or going to be able to hold political offices, especially in local politics. And then they're going to be able to prioritize essentially their own needs within a communities, within cities, within local, even at state and national levels. And that's going to be not necessarily the best for the city as a whole, and it may not, especially economically or infrastructurally, be the most um, or the best option, I guess, for all of those who actually live and embody the city. Um, and then it talks about, again, highways and city services. So highways were originally intended for businesses. They were not intended for just your everyday populations. They were intended to make business, like most infrastructure, was intended to make the capitalism market be able to expand, to be able to continue, and to do so in a way that not all the cost was on the capitalist. And so if they could convince state governments to fund these highway systems, that it with the guise of, hey, that's going to bring in jobs, that's going to bring in trade, that's going to bring in whatever it is, those things are going to both do that, yes, but really the prominent individuals who are going to who made out the most in that particular process at the time when it started were those who easily needed to move their products with more accessibility and needed to do so on someone else's dime. And that's the same with most city services, right? That's going to be the same with the electric grid, the water grid. And that's why a lot of those things, now that they are um, common almost everywhere in the United States, are getting put back into private ownerships, and cities are selling those particular resources off to private industry so that they can then be capitalized on as well. And then conflict theory does a lot of talking about which communities are policed and monitored, and why, and specifically how your book talks about specifically how people that are poor and communities that are poorer are going to be policed and monitored in much higher frequency. And that would also include a lot of your marginalized populations who have been disenfranchised by the economic system as it is, and so have and continue to be a disproportionate rate of the impoverished within any kind of city or location. All right, so let's talk a little bit about alienation and community, because these are the two kind of polar opposites when it comes to what we look for in cities. So there's been a lot of studies talking about how cities can alienate individuals, and a lot of that comes out of essentially if you don't find your tribe or a group, then the city can feel very impersonal. It can feel very superficial. And that's because your day-to-day relations, because there are so many people, we can't have relationships with every single person that we interact with or meet when we're in a big city like that. And so kind of tucking our head down and not acknowledging every single stimuli that comes in allows us to process the massive amount of overstimulation that comes with living in a city. But what that also does is create this impersonality to the city, and can make people who don't have social networking groups already in place, or community accesses to specifically community pockets, feel really alienated. However, on the flip side, when you do find specific community organizations, especially if you're a marginalized population, you're going to have a lot more access to people that look, think, act like you, or within city structures, right? So if you're, say, an LGBTQ plus member in a really rural area, the likelihood that you're going to be able to find a large community base or a large group of people that are like you, or that are even positively acting towards you, isn't really high. Now, that depends again on the rural area and the state and where you are and a whole bunch of other things. But for the most part, most cities, almost, I don't know of a real, especially not a mega city, but I don't know of many large cities that don't have LGBTQ plus resources, community centers, groups, ways in which you can interact with other LGBTQ plus members, which gives you a sense of community that you may not have ever had living in other places, or living in places outside of cities. And so there's kind of this catch-22, right? If you don't find those communities, or you can't find those communities, or you can't access those communities, you're gonna feel really alone amongst a crap ton of people, versus where if you can find community, you're going to be able to experience possibly a um, a sense of likeness with people that you are around that you may not have experienced in other places. And again, this is an oversimplification. It doesn't happen in that specific this or this. There can be a wide mix of these things, right? You can be at a work environment that may not be very community based, but end up having a good social group of friends, or you could have a very alienating social network that's very superficial. But you could have a really good work environment, right? That's very positive, etc. So it just kind of depends on who you are. But my point and the situations you're in, but my point is that it's not all or nothing, right? That's that there's a wide scope of this, but there's multitudes of reasons for why alienation is so common and also why community is so common, depending on some of your identity statuses and your access to any kind of community resources. So again, there was a study done and it really put people who live in cities into like 5 specific groups. Now I'm going to tell you that there's emphasis and wording and language in these that I have changed a bit, but also because they denote a particular level or hierarchy already within the wording. And it's something that we need to think about as we're doing our own social studies or sociology studies, or being just sociologists out in the world. And so cosmolites, cosmopolites, I don't know. Anyway, are the intellectuals, the artists, the professionals, the entertainers, right? These are the people generally at the top of the economic hierarchy. These are the people that generally have affluence, power, et cetera, et cetera. You have your singles, your early 20s to 30s that are typically going to move out to the suburbs when they get married, but this is particularly they're young, they're experiencing the city, they may be fresh out of college, or they may have moved to the city to for other reasons. But these are kind of your individuals who are going to be hanging out at bars, or they're going to particularly run in relatively similar social circles, right? You have the trapped, and that's going to be your individuals that are too economically disserviced to be able to afford to get out of the city. And so they've either grew up there or they moved there with the hopes of particular economic gain that did not happen. They may have lost their job, et cetera, but they can't really afford to be anywhere else. So they're kind of stuck there because moving is expensive. There's the deprived, which is or destitute, which is really those who have mental health struggles, little income or education. And these are going to be individuals who are going to need a lot of resources. They're going to struggle to make ends meet, et cetera. And then you have your ethnic villagers, which are your tightly knit communities, usually working class and usually some kind of marginalized group. All right. Again, not and the main goal here in talking about these different groups and talking about this alienation concept and this also community concept is really to understand that not everyone experiences the city in the same ways, and that these can be specifically tied to the identities you carry and to the relationships that you hold within the city dynamic. All right. We're going to run through, I know it looks like a lot, but we're going to run through this fairly quickly. So urban violence, again, so you have youth gangs. Those are going to be where essentially a lot of where you grew up and your options, your ability to acquire access to places that do not include this kind of violence and or other social hierarchical statuses are going to matter, right? So your neighborhood matters. If this is how you gain status within your own neighborhood or within your own specific community, then that's going to end up being a very prominent option for you. That's going to be the one that you look towards. And that's going to be why a reason why people consistently join gangs. You're also going to see that they do so to protect themselves from other gangs or their loved ones from other gangs. There were 2 studies specifically they talked about this in Cohen. They talked about especially males trying to create that desire of valued identity, and that they clash. There's a distinct clash between the middle and lower classes. So really not wanting to be part of that middle class, wanting to specifically reject those ideas, being part of the ideology, I guess, of gang membership. And then Miller talking about it being the key is really identity, and that these particular groups value trouble, excitement, toughness, smartness, autonomy, and fate. And so really they look at the violence that happens to them as, well, if it's my time, it's my time. So that fate piece allowing them the ability to kind of brush off the ways in which that um, lifestyle is incredibly inherent to violence and short lifespans. Gangs have become not just these, street gangs, but there's also organizations or bigger gangs that have national ties. So think Hell's Angels. You're going to think your Bloods, your Crips, those kind of gangs are going to have more of a national based institution, but you also are going to see international gangs like the Triads, that are going to not just appear in the country of which they originated, but they're also going to appear in specific ports or specific bigger cities in other international areas. And then gangs attract the disenfranchised, right? They attract people who don't have other options. The reason for that is because without other options, then you're going to figure out or try to create the power and status for yourself that you can to keep yourself safe in whatever ways that looks like. And if safety looks like safety from one gang, but not another, as opposed to having two gangs that you're not safe from, then you make judgment calls, right? And you make calls that suit the situation that you're currently in. It's a kind of forced power. So they feel their power specifically comes from the violence that they do, and that the respect that they earn from that violence. And so while it is not a, say, political power, though sometimes that force can become in a political environment, that power is inherent on violence. It's inherent on this need to be violent to women, this need to be violent to other gangs, this need to be violent to anyone that poses a threat to their gang, et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, your book kind of talked about girl gangs, or this gendered notion of power. So even within these gangs, or within females within other gangs, their roles tend to be different. They tend to be over sexualized. They tend to be exploited in a sexual way. They tend to be carriers or mules for drugs or things of that nature, as opposed to leadership positions and or positions where they're inherently in violent settings, with the exception of rape or sexual assault. But on the flip side, there's also a growing number of gangs that are specifically for women and just women. And those are growing in their intensity and their level of violence that they particularly do within their community. And that's something that's been on the radar for a good while. And then you talk about violence in schools. So school shootings in particular is a big conversation within the US, and it's rightfully so, right? These are things that are happening to our little things that are happening that didn't happen when I was in school. I never had to do an active shooter drill. Now I did bomb threat drills, and some that weren't drills, right? That were just bomb threats. But my kids, even in preschool, were doing active shooter drills in the public education system. So it's something that we have to think about in a very different way. We also have to talk about who primarily the shooters are in school shootings, and primarily it is white young males. And generally that comes down to, and that's not always the case, but generally it comes down to this idea that, and sociologists have studied this for a long time, but this notion that society owes me something, or that society, I'm inherently supposed to get certain privileges or things for my status and I'm not getting those. So because I'm not getting those and I'm living a life that may include a lot of bullying or may include a lot of social pressure or economic inequality, et cetera, and those or has ties to any kind of notion that some other group particularly are the reason that I'm not getting what I feel is due to me, creates those ideologies in these young white males who then end up perpetuating those ideologies within violent acts. This is something that, again, is becoming more and more prevalent. And the answers for that and the ways in which we deal with that particular social problem vary widely. And I believe we get into that in the education chapter as well. So I'm not going to touch on that as much here. There's other school violence, again, gangs being within schools, and school bullying is a huge problem. And again, we'll get into a lot more of this particular notion when we get into the education section. So talking about population, so population shifts, specifically region restratification is a shift in a region's population, wealth, or power. You have city shifts, or essentially where people are moving to versus where people are moving away from. So like places like Detroit are places that people are moving away from because the big proponents of jobs and things of that nature aren't there as much anymore, versus places that people are moving to, which is ironically in Texas or some of the coasts, the Floridas, even the Californias. And you notice that a lot of the red dots are very isolated around specific cities and specifically in this region. And they might just be moving to more resources or allocations. So like those around Atlanta might be moving specifically towards Atlanta, things of that nature. All right. So empowerment or enterprise zone. So this is where essentially businesses are given tax credits for being able to create employment in high unemployment areas, right? And they also gain wage credits for any kind of full-time hiring or hiring that they do that lasts a specific amount of time. They also get tax credits for improving facilities or providing resources for neighborhood gentrification, etc. And they get low interest loans for business in the areas. The problem here is that that doesn't always have the intended benefits. And by that, we mean we have a lot of areas that get this gentrification process happening where individuals that currently live there, when people come in and buy out these properties and do them up really well and sell them for exceedingly more and create this neighborhood process of making the property much more equitable, they also raise property taxes in a way that people can't necessarily keep up with. And or they raise the cost of living when it comes to shops, when it comes to groceries, when it comes to gas, etc., or transportation options in general, in ways that economically are unfavorable to those who already were in those places. And then on top of that, when you have this empowerment or enterprise zones, you also have a lot of people who come in for those jobs who are already part of these companies, or people who are not necessarily within that unemployment group that end up taking these jobs, or they're not, the people in those unemployment groups are not qualified for these jobs. All right. So educating the poor, there's some issues in this, right? There's some issues in educating those in impoverished areas. They have higher dropout rates. They're hungry. They have lack of resources, lack of safety. The buildings are sometimes in shambles. There's a whole lot of issues that come not only with trying to teach to kids who have bigger problems with meeting their basic needs, but also try to teach in a way that garners them a future, right? It can't just be, hey, I'm going to teach you social studies lesson number 42 so you can pass a state exam, because that state exam has absolutely no benefit to them, because they're already going to have a lack of resources. They already know that their schools, no matter how many resources it gets, not going to be their home. They already know that there's going to be severe issues they're going to see when they get home, like who's going to pay or keep the lights on, who's going to watch the baby sister, who's going to do this or that, or etc. So they talk about a better education and what it needs, right? And these are going to be motivated teachers, better methods that prioritize um, these particular communities and what it is their needs are. Smaller class sizes, innovative curricula that aspires the youth to something, right? That works to their strengths, right? These youth have to deal with a host of issues that are not in public education systems in other areas. And so if you cater to the ways in which they understand economics because they have had to figure out how to balance what bills you pay and how you prioritize those when you don't have enough, right? Or you figure out a way to use what these kids are good at and aspire them to take that to a different level, to decentralize and have a less bureaucratic system, right? These kids don't need a bunch of bureaucracy and red tape and map testing and et cetera. They need systems that work for them. They need curriculum paths that actually have some relevance to their lives. They need work study programs and things that, again, ensure that future, right? These are not kids that are striving to go to college. These are kids that are striving to not get evicted by the end of the week. And that comes with a different kind of education. That comes with a different kind of prioritization of what you're looking for in an education setting. And then again, adding some scholarship for adult dropouts to be able to come back and finish to get their degree to get their high school diploma or other education, depending on where they dropped out. And then you're going to have you need corporate learning, you need childcare facilities, you need positive reinforcement, you need trade programs, all of these things, again, that are looking towards a future for these students and making sure that they have options. So some future problems within our particular cities, things that we have to start talking about are really the higher cost of living and the lower income due to those inflation ratios, and how that's going to impact people's ability to be in these cities, people's ability to thrive within them, or even have a specific quality of life. You're also going to see a need for funding locally, state, and federally for different services and infrastructure. And that's just because infrastructure doesn't last forever. And you've got to figure out how to allocate those sources in a way that don't just benefit those who are wealthy and those at the top who get to make those decisions. Homelessness is going to continue to be a conversation piece. And again, we're going to continue to talk about this, but we talked about it a lot in some of these other parts of this module. And so I'm going to go ahead and kind of keep going. And then gentrification, again, how that impacts those underserved in the community and where they go once their neighborhoods are gentrified, and where and how that impacts these underprivileged individuals. And then there's also social policies that are needed to just meet basic human needs at a everyone level. All right, so now we're going to get into these theories of population and kind of go from there. This is the rest of that module. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But really, we're going to talk about the debate over population increase and carrying capacity of the earth and these kinds of things. And so there's this conversation surrounding this particular graphic and how population just jumped, it just skyrocketed between 1800 to now, and really having that conversation about what was the catalyst, what was the thing that took this from such an extended period of time to holy moly, that's a lot of people. And really there's two kind of main camps on this. There's one that talks about public health and lessening the death rate. So this is talking about your getting your indoor plumbing, getting your infrastructure for washing, for any kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Hygiene, right? Any kind of hygiene processes. And then you're also going to have another one, which is kind of this potato or this idea. And it's not just particular potatoes, but it's lessening this inability to feed oneself and being able to promote access. If you can make a whole bunch of access, then you don't have to do things like infant aside, which is getting rid of infants that um, wouldn't survive due to like um, the amount of social pressure or the amount of social resources that are available. And once you get things like the potato, or you can mass produce specific crops and you're doing so well enough to continue to have access, then that access or that excess allows you to be able to populate and continue to populate more and more people. So there's also a debate on what happens next. So does our population continue to just exponentially grow and we're gonna like just be shoulder to shoulder at some point on this planet? Does does it kind of level off? Do people stop having babies? Like, what does this look like? And so there's a lot of debate in this, and we're going to kind of get into this and go over it in several. The rest of the slides are really focused on kind of this topic. The Malthusian is really this idea that there's this exponential growth that outgrows the food supply, right? So this is that we're going to keep being this multiplicative population growths. This 2 became 4, became 8, became 16, etc., to the extent that it just never ends, to infinity and beyond. And there was really 2 kind of camps that really resulted or responded to this idea. And that's the new Malthusians that really are like, yeah, this makes sense. This multiplicative population growth makes sense. And again, these are your more pessimistic individuals, or considered the more pessimistic outlook. And they're talking about that 1 in 9 go to bed hungry at night. And so in Bangladesh, you already have half the population that doesn't get enough protein. And so obviously there are things that are happening here and dynamics that are happening here that the food system, how it is currently operating, is not viable for the amount of population. If we continue to increase that, that's going to be really big issues. And then you have the anti-Malthusians, which are essentially the more optimistic group. And they're talking about how population will kind of level out as birth rates decrease when age and death rates get higher. So you stop having the capacity to have children at a certain age. So as the population starts to age, those particular individuals are not going to continue to have babies, and it's going to kind of taper off. And it has this 4 stages. So you have stable population, which is where your birth rate and your death rate are pretty on par. And then you have your rapidly growing population. So your birth rate is just going to be exponential, but your death rate is going to go down due to medical advancements. Then you're going to have your stabilizing the population in your third, where your birth rates are going to come down, but you're going to kind of stay steady at that death rate because technology is going to keep lives as kind of that more static number. And then stage 4, even possibly into this shrinking population where because birth rates were already in decline as it was, the death rate stays the same and the birth rates continue to dip below that line. And again, that's more of a theoretical. These are both theoretical ideas, and neither one have been completely proven, and we'll kind of talk about that. But they essentially fall under the notion that population will level out as birth rates decrease, and death rates essentially get higher or like stay still. And that some countries even fear population shrinkage or unlevel replacement rates, just because that creates a different social power dynamic, and that more food is available for each person now than ever in the past. And so just because it's not distributed equitably does not mean that there's not enough capacity to feed the population growth. And then that agricultural inefficiency, political corruption, maldistribution of the earth's abundance, and war are things that are going to essentially keep that particular those particular population notions in check, right? So the fact that the food system doesn't feed everybody and that it has this inequality, also builds in a death rate that doesn't have everybody achieving this high death, like this higher age of death. On top of that, political corruption is going to get in the way of being able to feed everybody when they need fed. And resources are part of the capitalist system that will get exploited in a way. And these are the optimists, right? And war will continue to do some leveling of population numbers. And so I post a question here, and at the bottom of several of these slides, what do you think? Is there a middle ground? Is there something that we're missing as part of this debate, etc.? But they keep going, right? So we're going to talk about these particular theories in reference to our major theoretical camps. And so symbolic interaction is really going to talk about why are poor wanting to have large families? And that really comes down to the status of motherhood and this connection to this idea of God's favoring me with a large amount of children. And so if I continue to have children, then that's because God is favoring me. And parenthood being a measure of womanhood or manhood. The more kids you can sire, the more that the male has prestige in a community. And that children are future and social security. So, right, these are individuals who at some point are not going to be part of the working public. And because of that, they're going to need somebody to have some kind of financial assistance coming back to them. And so if they have these children, they're going to have the ability to have someone that takes care of them because they do not have necessarily governmental programs that will do so. And then again, children as economic gain, because in a lot of these impoverished areas, especially in unindustrialized nations, these children are also working as an income producer in the household. The functionalist perspective is that catastrophic catastrophes. There we go. I don't know why that was such a struggle, but it was. Catastrophes are functional, right? They're part of the system. And because of that, when things like natural disasters happen, etc. And I think they talk about tsunamis in particular in your textbook. But when these things happen, it's a function that regulates the population numbers. They also talk about modern medicine as a latent dysfunction of that balance. And so modern medicine is creating this unequal birth to death ratio. And that's just because it's extended lifetimes so much faster than the birth rate could be regulated. And that's just because modern medicine continues to provide treatments for things in a very, very rapid amount of time comparatively to how long humans have been reproducing. And then population pyramids change depending on the wealth and industry of a country. And so when you look at, say, Mexico, you're going to see a significant portion coming into the age of reproduction versus maybe the United States, where you're going to see a lot more in an elderly like the 40s or elderly, but a lot more out of that reproductive age, or that age in which you're typically having children and or people who don't want children. And then the conflict perspective is going to look at how corporations explicitly create situations where people can't be their own food producer, that they will take out things that might make food production more viable to more people. They'll make sure that subsidies are available so that people get paid not to farm in land that they have, and that they'll talk about how they can manifest the prices so that they can make it inaccessible for certain people to get the food resources that they need. And you're also going to see how like things like ethanol for your gas is going to be prioritized because that particular industry can make more money than using the corn to feed other people. And so there's the possibility for people to go hungry based on this desire for companies to rather produce the food product to be made into ethanol for gas and things of that nature that can garner them more profit for that particular crop. And so again, we talked about paying farmers not to farm, but again, that's part of kind of this food politics, right? Politics influence the way in which we operate and the things in which we prioritize. And if we don't prioritize food as an inherent resource or something that is something that everyone should have, then it doesn't stay that way, right? It creates this inequality all the way together because we're not regulating it in a way that prioritizes humans' hunger over profit, right? And resource scarcity also creates unequal political and social instability. And that's kind of inherent to the capitalist process. And we've talked about that a couple of times. And then political instability in some areas creates equal power for others, or in excess of power. So if we have this politically unstable third world, they're going to work for less. They're going to be refugees. They're going to need certain things. These countries are going to want specific kinds of resources. They're going to need cheap things, or they're going to sell their resources for cheaper. And that's going to help out businesses in more influential areas. And or that's places they can add manufacturing plants with little to no safety regulations, et cetera. But that particular political instability can be something that is capitalized on. But it also allows other governments to come in and essentially make the rules and set up the economic loans and sponsorships that leave these areas that are already in poverty and possibly seeing war or severe political instability in times where they're not going to get ahead. They're essentially paying to be behind, and paying to be behind in a way that benefits more industrialized societies. And then again, I also added in, and we didn't talk about this a lot, but it's in the net, like it's in one of the, we'll talk about it more in depth in one of the other modules, but it also creates environmental ruin, which is experienced within different global places and even within the United States in very different ways, depending on your level of economic stability and your other marginalized populations statuses. All right, so let's talk about policy in the future. So when we get back to this, these more pessimistic groups of the new Malthusians, they talk about natural disasters, pollutions, water shortages, and overfishing, or just resource overextension in general, the zero population growth and unindustrialized countries, and talking about capitalism driving this scarcity, and that some places nowhere near slowing. So places like Africa are going to consistently continue to build, and because of the way in which they are prioritizing having children and et cetera as part of their social system and their social norms. And then their policies. Now, again, when we talk about these particular policies, these are like the most extreme versions of either one of these idealized systems. So just as a reminder, this is not something that like, hey, everybody who thinks this way or thinks that might be geared towards this particular framework is going to support all of these, right? It's saying that these are the most extreme policy options that would be proposed by this particular group. And that's encouraging infanticide, which is the killing of young or the killing of infants, refusing to send money to famished or starving populations to essentially starve them out and create a higher death rate. Withdrawing modern medicine from poor nations, again, to ensure that infectious disease continues to spread and take lives. Raising the age of sexual consent and at age at which people are allowed to get married, or requiring a license to have children and requiring abortions for unlicensed pregnant women. So again, this is kind of control of bodies, control of decision making, control of family planning. encouraging queer unions that cannot biologically produce, sterilize baby girls to ensure, notice how they're not talking about sterilizing baby boys, just girls, to again ensure the zero population growth, and really having this conversation about sterilization and this lack of autonomy over that family planning part, or reproductive processes. And then sterilizing each woman after the birth of her first child, or establish national systems where free abortions to any women for any reason, et cetera, et cetera. And these are really kind of the polar extreme of this idea again. And then you have the more optimistic that are really going to be talking about larger populations, equal higher quality of life through just efficiency in general. When you have a higher population, you have to have certain social services like transportation and things that are part of those communities. And so it's going to just inherently make your city or your area more efficient because it has to be. Otherwise, it gets bogged down just systemically and at a functionalist level. And then it's going to talk about investment into infrastructure, higher rates of problem solvers, just because the population number is up. You're going to have more people that are able to solve problems. You're going to have food production, again, that outpaces the population growth, and the population growth end up slowing on its own. And then some of the more extreme policies that they might think will be encouraging population growth or even technological development, and some of the more crazy technological development, reducing the age of consent to when girls are biologically able to reproduce, even if they are not biologically designed to be ready to carry at that point. But once you hit your period, you can now have babies, keep popping them out. Encourage teenagers to experiment sexually, including in ways that leave teenagers pregnant. Offer incentives for women to bear many children, discourage the education of women, make abortion and birth control illegal, export Western medicine and health technologies to the least industrialized world to reduce the death rate, and encourage science, technology, industry, and agriculture. And while some of those things don't sound bad, others, again, take away that autonomy and that reproductive control. All right. And then the last one we have here is just kind of the future. What does the future look like? For the new Malthusians, achieving zero population growth is really the goal, right? It's achieving a birth rate and a death rate that are the same. And that's generally acceptable social policy implications. They encourage women to go to school and to graduate from school, encourages women to want careers. The distribution of free or low cost birth control devices, teach zero population growth to children in school so they know the weight, pay women to be sterilized, and increase food production and make internal aid dependent on countries reforming. And then again, on the other side, talking about carrying capacity, talking about ecological destruction, having higher food prices or starvation, more famines, more refugees, and more conflict, just because, again, we're looking at this future that looks a little more bleak because this is the pessimistic view, and that the conflict will equal more discrimination by the powerful to the masses. And then the more optimistic view is that poverty has already been cut in half and that more places will achieve that population shrinkage, or that fourth stage of their model, and the education and solutions will create change. An example of that being maybe biotech or designer animals that are, say, maybe have chickens that lay more eggs, I think was one of their examples, or meat that is leaner and less fatty, etc. And so again, this is going to create a lot of different social questions. And it doesn't, again, have to be one extreme or the other. There's a lot of different conversations that need to happen within all of those policy ideas. And we never really have a good fix on what our population is going to do, just because we don't know. Things like the pandemic will come up, and that's going to kill and has killed millions already, and decreased the in the United States, at least, decreased the average life expectancy for both men and women. And so really having conversations surrounding what these policies latent functions are and what their unintended consequences are, and kind of going from there. All right, so that's everything I have for you for this module. Thank you. Please make sure you ask any questions that you have. And as always, contact me if you need anything.